Welcome to Managing Love Intelligently, the podcast that optimizes your success and letting the right one into your heart, life, and home. I'm Jason.
And I'm Steve. Well, at least we're trying to do that. Give us a minute.
Yes. Just listen to this in every episode at least 20 times and send them to 20 friends and it will come true.
And the monkey's paw will never be yours.
Yes. So Steve is a licensed marriage and family therapist with over 30 years experience. And I'm a guy who asks him questions. How this works is I present a topic to Steve, which I plan ahead of time, but Steve has no idea about, and we talk about it for an hour or so. Today's topic is integrating spirituality and sexuality. And before we kick off the conversation, if you have a question for Steve, visit stevening.com and fill out the contact form. At the end of each episode, Steve will answer a listener question, so stay tuned for that. So this idea of integrating spirituality and sexuality was something I heard Steve talk about a few times, and I'm interested in learning more. So I want to just ask you, Steve, what do you exactly mean by this?
Well, I love talking about this topic. I'm caught, as always, a bit flat-footed on when you bring these things up because I had no idea that we're going to talk about this. But typically, what I do in my office is I go to the whiteboard, and I'd like people who are at home either to visualize this or even actually get out a piece of paper and just draw it out. And because if you draw a line across the paper, and that's the horizon, and the stick figure of a human being standing on the ground, and then up above just a couple of fleecy white clouds. The clouds represent spirituality, and because they're ephemeral and they're just hard to define. They're always shifting and growing and changing. And the ground beneath his feet or her feet represents sexuality. And if you can have an arrow going from the ground up and an arrow going from the clouds down to the earth, it stands for that conversation that can happen where my sexuality can ground my spirituality and help it to not develop too many flights of fancy that are untethered to reality. Well, I'm going to follow the Lord and I will never masturbate and I will never have sex with anyone till I'm married. I know I'm only 12, but I'm pretty sure I can do this. Or those are sort of crazy thoughts. Or my spouse doesn't want to have sex with me, but a promise is a promise, and I'm going to stick it out. I don't care how many more years it's going to take before I die miserably. So those two would be examples of spirituality getting a little big for its britches and forgetting that it's here to serve us. And that's what the downward arrow from the clouds down to the earth. What's great about spirituality is it provides meaning to our lives. It answers those questions. Why am I here? What is life all about? What am I supposed to do in this world? And what is my purpose? And those are great questions. And sexuality by itself doesn't answer those questions. And spirituality by itself can get awfully distant from reality. And people can get into weird cults. But typically, even the people in or out of cults, people who are influenced strongly by religion, are typically those who have sexuality in one compartment of their brain and spirituality in an opposite part of the brain, and the two compartments never talk to each other. There's never that dialogue that's symbolized by the two arrows going up and down. And I like the idea of that dialogue because it helps the religious person, or in my case, the non-religious person, to understand what beliefs are working for them and to be open to the discovery that certain beliefs don't work. Oh, I tried that, but that didn't work for me. Most of us don't say that about our faith. I mean, if you're born into a faith, especially, we don't say, well, I tried it for a few years, but Mom, it's really not working for me. I keep masturbating. And we don't want to have those conversations. And people from the LGBTQ plus community, they don't have those conversations, but they've kind of lived quietly on the edges of those conversations. But just as sexuality is the birthright of all humans, I believe also so too is spirituality. Now, I don't identify as an atheist because, any more than I identify as a non-believer in Santa Claus, but I have been a believer in the past, and I. But whether I'm a believer or I'm not, I still have a spirituality, because spirituality is about answering those questions about the unseen portions of life. And if one were to draw a large Venn diagram on their paper, that big circle, and represent that with the letter S for spirituality, and then draw a smaller circle inside the large Venn diagram, and that would be a subset marked R. Religion would be a subset of spirituality. So one need not be religious to be spiritual. Mm-hmm. And I've had many young people say to me in therapy, when we're talking about this, they kind of cringe and look at me sheepishly, or even sometimes with a hostile look, and they'll say, I'm not religious, or I'm not into religion. And I always laugh because that's what I do. But I think the disservice that's been done to our society is somehow those of us who are non-religious have allowed ourselves to often be led into a belief, then therefore we're not spiritual, or we don't need to be concerned with spirituality. But so that's generally what I'm talking about in a general sort of way, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So you were religious though for a long time of your life,
for a long time. I mean, as a little boy up in Alaska in the summer visiting my grandparents, I gave my heart to Jesus at a vacation Bible school tent revival meeting with, the sawdust on the floor and all the rest. And from then on, it was, I think, in fits and starts, I would go forward with one church or another church. And I kept looking for, quote, the right church, unquote. And for me, that was part and parcel of my alcoholic family upbringing, where having the right answer was ever so important, as if somehow you could look it up or assemble enough data and come up with the right answer. And really, ultimately, I decided that they were all equally flawed. And by that, I mean all of the major world religions were equally flawed, and that none of them are particularly helpful when it comes to managing love intelligently.
And how long was that? So when you were a kid, was that like you were 10 or like how
12?
12. So you were 12, you give your life to Jesus, and that goes all the way till you were like 60, right?
My mid 60s, actually. So it really wasn't until fairly recently that I finally, the last vestigial little wisps of faith just evaporated, and I was left with nothing. And and it's not true that I was left with nothing, because there are many ways one might enter into a more spiritually oriented way of life, through meditation. And for me, meditate, and there are as many millions of ways to meditate as there are humans on the planet. So for me, the stereotype of the practitioner sitting cross-legged and chanting something over and over with his eyes shut, that doesn't really work for me. I've tried it and it's not my thing. But I've developed a practice of meditation that works for me, and I've enjoyed it a lot. And I feel like I'm growing spiritually, and that I'm seeing things more clearly day by day. But it's been quite a journey. And I think, and even to this day, though, I would say the words, at least some of the words of Christ, like "judge not, lest you be judged," those kind of words are very dear to me. And they're very meaningful. So I think my big beef is not with the Buddha or the Christ or many of the other major repositories of human wisdom that have evolved over the centuries. I think it's really mostly organized religion, because organized religion is a lot like any other corporation, and corporations were essentially invented as a as a legal stand-in for a human being, and corporations do have rights, but unlike human beings, they do not have consciences, and they exist to serve themselves. And so the humans, sadly, for whom the religion was invented in the first place, humans often end up getting short shrift from the religions of the world. And some of the most spiritual people, like Lao Tzu, who wrote the Tao, he, long before Christianity was a thing, it wasn't even a religion when he created it. It was, in fact, somewhat anti-religious, but nevertheless, the human capacity for religion seemed to grab hold of that one too. And so now we have Taoist temples and priests, when really I think the essence of Taoism is really non-religious.
So then during that time from your 12 to around mid-60s, you mentioned earlier about the two sides of the brain, like you have sexuality in one and spirituality in the other. Did you feel like you were divided for a good portion of your life, or?
No, I think the person who thinks that way is often unaware, because every religion has a lot to say about sexuality, consisting mostly of thou shalt not. So thou shalt not intermarry with someone of a different religion. Thou shalt not have sex with same-sex partners. Thou shalt not, and everybody is against masturbation, it seems like. I don't know what masturbation ever did to them. But there's just a lot of rules about sex, regulating sex.
And what do you think that's about?
I think mostly, well, there are a couple of things I think. One is, I think religion is extremely uncomfortable with sexuality because the corporation of religion recognizes in sexuality a competing brand. And that competing brand offers a sense of awe and meaningful connection and a sense of wonder.
A lot more fun than church.
And less expensive.
Yeah.
And so I think sexuality is really a competitor with religion for all of that. So religion has typically got a vested interest in the repression of sexuality. And when religion does talk in an attempt to be friendly with sexuality, it fails to see sexuality in any but the most titillating terms. So it doesn't really talk, I haven't seen any religion talk intelligently about meaningful intimacy and what it's like to truly share one's life with another in a safe way.
Yeah.
So I think the last thing that really crushed my faith, my vestigial faith at that, was just realizing that religion wasn't really helping people manage sexuality intelligently or love intelligently, relationships intelligently. It was that Procrustean bed of rigidity and that unyielding nature that, well, you've made your bed, now lie in it. This is the way it's got to be. And instead, like science, I think real spirituality allows for the possibility of someone having made a mistake. And so we get to admit that and then go back and try to run different experiments and see what does work for us.
But did you feel too that you were hindered in any way by having religion be that big a part of your life as far as your sex life goes?
Was I hindered?
Yeah, like were you hindered in ways where you?
Well, I think.
Or were you not following the rules? Like,
oh, you mean was I sexually active even though I was going to church?
Yeah, and were you, and also just like, was that blocking something in your head sexually, like because you had church on your mind, or do you get what I mean? Because I feel like even like I grew up Catholic. And I feel like there's still things that are kind of like working, like letting go of some stuff.
Yeah, you're in the process, right?
Yeah, and I never even was that into it, but it's like it was still. I went to it every Sunday. Till I was confirmed, and then I went to CCD. It's kind of like a brainwashing, and
catechism.
No, it was just like CCD was I don't even know what it stands for, but it was like you went on like a Wednesday night and you studied Bible stories and things like that. And I was completely tuned out almost to the whole thing, but still some of it still got in there.
Mm-hmm.
And not a lot, thankfully. But I mean, it was like you had to memorize your prayers and do stuff like that. And they talked about like lectures on God and gospel and things like that.
Well, I think here in America, at least, religion is in the ether we breathe, and it's really hard to get away from. But like you, I have had, and really all of my clients, I mean, I've got so many clients who have religious beliefs that are irrational or based on religion. They have irrational beliefs based on religion, even though they themselves haven't been in a church in decades. Mm-hmm. And they subscribe to no particular religious faith. But they still have these beliefs like, well, if I'm, dating, and I don't mean dating as a euphemism for sex, but if I'm dating more than one woman, that's just wrong. Mm-hmm. And like, why? Well, it just seems like it's not right. And then you get further into it and it's like a violation of monogamy. But you're not married to anybody and you're not in a committed relationship with anybody. Why would you hinder yourself in your search for a good relationship by limiting yourself to only dating one person at a time when you're capable of doing so much more? And so we talk about those things, and it's really clear to me that most of the world is still laboring under some sort of burden that has been handed down from religion.
Yeah. But were you ever burdened by it? Or were you
yeah, sure. Like I think one of the subjects that comes up is masturbation in my office, and asking people how they felt the first time that they were masturbating. And almost everybody said, well, I felt really weird, or I felt guilty, or I felt uncomfortable. Nobody runs out and says, Mom, Dad, guess what I did? Right? Nobody's talking about it in any way, including Mom or Dad, right?
Yeah, I remember there's one kid at lunch when I was like in 7th or 8th grade, and he talked about it a lot to the lunch table. It was like every day he was talking about how he was doing it, where he was putting it. Like,
well, those ADHD kids, they are so much fun. I don't know, what was going on with him, but in general, I think most people are pretty uncomfortable with it. And that's one reason. I think it's complicated because humans are more than just one thing. So even a religious person is not only a religious person. They're also a person with a sexuality, and they have feelings, and there's all kinds of other things going on. But I've met men who are barely religious at all in their backgrounds, who felt like they could never get a divorce because it was the wrong thing to do, even though this one particular individual, his story from the 40s, his wife came to him, and after 7 years of having had normal marital relationships with sex and everything, and having had children, one day she just announced out of the blue, I don't want to have sex with you anymore. Mm-hmm. And she climbed into a bottle, and that was the end of their sex life for the duration of his life. Mm-hmm. But he never divorced her. And I mean, he was living like that with no sex, married to her longer than he had lived prior to that date. Wow. So that was the rest of his life. And I would say, and I said to him, with no particularly great insight, it was easy considering the troubles he was in, that's not a sustainable lifestyle. It's just not going to work. You're a human being with a sexuality, and your sexuality, like every other dimension of your being, has its concomitant needs. And there was no way that was ever going to work. And
what did he say?
Well, that was an example of his spirituality writing checks that his body could not cash. Mm. So that's why
too much spirituality then.
Well, not too much, but just one that was utterly undeveloped in terms of how to manage love intelligently. Mm. One that didn't allow for having made a mistake. Mm. I don't like to see people get married to the wrong person, or to get married in haste, or to get married when it's really very dodgy situation. But I've grown more relaxed over the years because I realized, but there is a remedy. and it's called divorce.
Yeah.
And and it's so much better once you figure out, oh, this was a big mistake. It's so much better to acknowledge that and move on. For the poor woman whose husband is physically abusive. Oh boy, this was a big mistake. Or the man who realizes that he was dating a gold digger and she never ever loved him. She was only taking advantage of him. Well, however much it costs, as the lawyers say, divorce in the end is worth it.
Yeah. But he couldn't get out of it. He
never gave himself
did he feel
permission
like
to
he
leave.
was doing the right thing then? Or obviously.
He'd made a promise. He'd made a commitment. He had to say, and I've met many men of his generation who felt the same way.
And it was so he'd made that commitment and promise, but then it was like destroying him at the same time. And it led to him committing a sex offense, if I'm right.
Yes, that is correct. And many others. And so these guys who go their whole lives paying their taxes, raising children, going to work, doing all the right things, but little by little, their moral resolve, their spirituality is eroded out from underneath them. What little spiritual evolution they've developed on their own, it was not prepared to handle this kind of a crisis. And that's why I think they do need these two disparate aspects of our humanity need to be integrated. And I think if we fail to do that, it's like knowing how to fly an airplane, but deciding not to use instruments, and it's nighttime and there's fog, but I know what I'm doing. Well, do you really?
And how would you define spirituality then? Like if you consider yourself a non-believer, if you're a spiritual person, doesn't that mean that you believe in something, or do you have some?
Well, yeah, I do have beliefs, but I think many of us who would say I'm spiritual but not religious, our spirituality would be as unique as our own individuality. So for me, again, for the third time, Jason, I would say spirituality is that portion of our existence that attempts to answer those questions about the unseen portions of life. So some of us come up with answers that are different from others. In fact, I would say almost everybody comes up with answers that are different than others. And for me, increasingly as time goes by, I would categorize my viewpoint as constantly less religious. Like you, I'm still working through some of that, but constantly growing in terms of humanism, where humans and their betterment and their worth are the supreme value, not the invisible man in the sky.
All right. But there's some room for the unknown, or just
absolutely, and there's always room for being wrong, and for not. I've gone from being the most doctrinaire little 15-year-old you'd ever want to meet or never want to meet to being the guy who's soon to be 70, and I feel very easygoing. I mean, people get to believe what works for them, and they get to believe even in things that don't work for them. But I don't really feel like I need to save anyone from themselves or from their belief system.
Do you feel then after you left, so at, say 65, you said mid-60s, after you left the church, did you feel there was a change within like this integration with the spiritual and the sexual? Was there like something that kind of freed up or melded together or something?
I think that's such a great question, because it really is something that I'm experiencing in recent years. And it is feeling increasingly, well, let me interrupt myself. It's feeling better and better all the time, but that's not what I meant to say. One of the things you hear a lot from religious people is about values, specifically family values. And I think for me, the idea that all human beings have values makes perfect sense. So even if I'm not a religious believer, of course I still have values. And those values, when I really understand them and codify them, they become morals, moral rules, like don't lie, or always tell the truth, that kind of thing, or try to live honorably. And then there are moral conundrums, so that, well, if the Nazis invaded and you were hiding Jews in your basement, what about lying then? Is that okay? So there are some moral conundrums that I myself struggle with, like what's the right thing to do. But what's really great about things now is that at the top of my values list, where there has always been and continues to be things like compassion and love, I now include things like freedom and also intellectual curiosity, and to go wherever my thought life and the evidence leads me, to follow reason and knowledge where that leads me. And so I heard a movie star, someone I really respect, I really like his work. He said that quite solemnly in an interview that he was a man of faith. And I remember that I used to be able to say that, but now I am a man of faith in reason and knowledge. And so it's different. I don't have faith in faith.
All right.
I don't even think, if one thinks about it, that even makes sense. And so reading someone like Richard Dawkins and his books on the topic, like The God Delusion, I think that's part of my spirituality. And it's, again, I don't identify as an atheist, but I think thinking about sexuality and romance from a spiritual perspective in terms of your values is essential if you're going to have a happy life.
And what would you say so you say happy life, but what are some of the benefits? Is there like something good?
Well, sure.
Does the sex get better?
Well, for me, it has.
Yeah.
And it was already amazing before, but I think the more my wife and I have departed from any sort of faith tradition, the more we have relied upon ourselves and our own vulnerability, our honesty, and where we've developed more and more freedom to enjoy what I would call, still metaphorically speaking, God's playground for grown-ups, so that we can enjoy the kind of intimacy that is not rule-bound, where we can share sexual thoughts, including jokes and playful thoughts, in a very free way that formerly, under the aegis of religion, I don't think that would have been allowed or tolerated. So, I've been drifting away from Christianity for years, decades really, but I just had such a difficult time really letting go of the idea that there wasn't a personal God who really loved me and cared about me. And I finally made that step, as I said, in the last few years, and it hasn't been bad. It's actually been pretty comfortable. I'm actually surprised at how comfortable that is, because it's always been humans all along who are the ones giving me love anyway.
Humans that are inhabited by the Spirit of God.
Humans that are loving, not the human-shaped objects who are not capable of love in the first place, but who can talk a mean show about it in the name of faith.
What do you run into people who you pitch this idea to in your office and then they're like, I'm not doing that, or that doesn't sound like something I can do, or are there people resistant to the idea of integrating these two things just because some people may be like, well, spirituality, like you said, is one thing. Sexuality is a different. I'm not mixing these two.
Yeah, you do not mix God and sex.
Yeah. Do you run into that at all?
I run into that a lot. And
what do you say?
So first of all, I don't try to convert anybody to my point of view. And I do work with people of all different faiths. And I try to help them integrate their sexuality into their belief system in a way that works for them. But I remember in a group therapy session so long ago, there was this wonderful young man who had committed a sex crime, and he was married and he was religious. And while he was sitting in jail awaiting trial, his then wife served him with divorce papers. And so much for the sacred commitment of marriage.
Yeah.
And
she wasn't like the other guy.
She was not
out.
into it. So, but she also was somewhat religious, but he went on to recommit his life to the Lord. And here he is in my group, poor soul. And guys are making jokes that are off color, and people are talking very openly about sexual fantasies and trying to learn how to manage their sexuality and their love lives in a way that makes sense. And I said, well, are you able to integrate sexuality and spirituality? He said, what do you mean? And I said, well, I mean, when you go into the bedroom with your girlfriend, do you acknowledge the presence of God there with you, and at least in your mind? And he said to me, with literally with the finger extended, you do not bring God into the bedroom. And I think I burst out laughing, and the men in my in the group were very confused, the religious and the non-religious, because it's like, well, how would you keep him out? I mean, if there is a God,
yeah,
how does that work? It's like a cone of silence, and deity cannot enter into the bedroom. And he felt that way very strongly for a number of years, that it was immoral somehow to bring God into a discussion. And by this time, mind you, he was already having occasional sexual lapses where he would be sexually active with a woman from the church, and they would tell each other the story, well, it's okay because we're going to get married.
Oh, I thought you were going to say it's okay because we're going to church or we go to the same church.
Well, we both love the Lord. We're going to get married. And then, with the narcissistic phase of love ending, their eyes would awaken to the truth. The scales would fall from their eyes, to use Paul's expression, St. Paul. And they would realize, I don't want to marry this person. I don't even like this person. And so then they would move on, and gentleman that he would relocate to another church and start over. And then he'd again repress his sexuality, but he would start dating because he was a normal young man. And he would again end up, first starting with hugs, and then that would progress to kissing. And then over time, they would end up having sex.
Another person from the new church?
Of course. Because you wouldn't want to be dating a non-Christian. Oh. Bite your tongue. God, Jason. And that's part of the gig, is you're not supposed to be unequally yoked, right? Marrying somebody outside of your faith tradition.
That's Christian.
Yeah, but even like Catholics have taught that for centuries.
Yeah.
That you're not.
I blocked out so much of it. It's like,
yeah, and then in the Catholic Church, it used to be like in the 50s, 60s, and maybe beyond that, if a non-Catholic married a Catholic, you had to, at the very least, the non-Catholic had to promise, if either to convert or at the very least to raise the children as Catholics.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah,
I remember one time I was going to be a cop originally, and I was doing an internship at the Will County Sheriff's Police, and there was I was with the crime scene unit, and there was two men and one woman, and the one guy was a pure science-based guy, and then the other guy was a conservative Christian who was marrying a Christian woman, and he was going through the process of becoming a born again, or not what is it, like he was taking over the faith or whatever.
He was converting.
He was converting, and the woman who was there as well, she was just another police officer, she was a Christian as well. And they were talking to the science guy and telling him how if he doesn't accept Jesus into their hearts, and they were explaining like Jesus is like a bridge, and if you don't do that, he's going to hell. And
HE double toothpicks.
The scientist guy's like, I just don't believe it, that stuff. It's like just stories to me. They're like, oh, Dan, you're
so lost.
And I'm just like sitting there watching this.
Because the God who loves you more than he loves anything else in his creation, he will have you burn in hell for eternity as a consequence of your not believing in his invisibility. Yeah. So, and the fact that he's inaudible and without taste and intangible. Yeah.
Yeah. I remember seeing that too and being like, God, just leave the poor guy alone. It's like, he doesn't, I'm like 21 years old at the time. And I'm like, leave the guy alone. He doesn't really buy it. I don't know why they're not like just letting him be like himself. And then the guy who was doing the conversion was also a huge fan of Rush Limbaugh.
Oh my gosh.
And he would like tell me, he's like, this guy is just the best. He's like, he says all the best things. And I'm just like, okay, so this guy is huge Rush Limbaugh fan. And not to say if people are fans of that guy, that's whatever. I don't really care.
Don't speak ill of the dead.
Yeah.
He's long gone.
But it was just like the combination of those two, I just thought was like hilarious.
Well,
like,
yeah. And
the Christian conservative.
We are all aware of those kinds of cognitive dissonances, sometimes known as hypocrisy or double-mindedness. But we're all guilty of it. To be human is to be hypocritical at times, where we have beliefs one way and we behave in another way. But I will say, in balance of this, that, my many clients who are religious, many of them are the sweetest, nicest people you'd ever want to meet. So it's not as though my office doesn't, I'm not doing a commercial for coming to my office, but I have experienced many wonderful religious people. So, there are the annoying ones, and I've been one of the annoying ones, so I should know.
You would try to convert people?
Oh, like, yeah. I have all these notches on my Bible. Are you kidding me?
What does that mean? Notches on your Bible? Does that mean
like on your gun, where you,
like
after
if you
shooting.
Is that real thing?
I don't. It's just
I got another one.
Yeah, it's so, getting to integrating sexuality and spirituality, I think it'd be possible for somebody from almost any faith tradition to do, but it would immediately set that individual apart from, I think, the rest of whatever congregation they were a part of, if they were to be attending any sort of organized religion. And it makes it,
not something you talk about when you're lighting the candles.
Yeah, it's really challenging. I think it's hard because you're not really of one mind in that group, whereas most people tend to think we should be of one mind if we're in one faith. And
that means one mind as they all think the same.
We share the mind of Christ or the mind of God, or we're all called to, one way. And I think it's particularly challenging for someone, maybe not like yourself, but someone who's just beginning that journey, who, falls in love with someone who goes to church regularly, to whom their faith is an important part of life. And then I'm needy and I'm lonely and I don't want to give up this relationship. So I maybe pay lip service to it, or I start attending church with her or she with him. And we toy with the idea of converting, or we actually do convert. And there's some churches who kind of specialize in that. I see you Mormons out there, where there's a lot of, I think, missionary dating that goes on. And I think for the people who are so tempted to sell out their own spirituality, it's not that they're selling out, it's that they don't even know what their spirituality is. There's sort of a vacuum there where I don't go to church and I don't believe anything particularly, like the science guy in your story. If he could have said, I absolutely believe there is no God. I have complete trust in the lack of evidence for any existence of someone like God. And I do not believe in that whatsoever. Now, that guy, that individual just made up in my imagination, would be very clear, that he could be very forthright with, say, a religious person he was dating. Yeah. Whereas the rest of us aren't usually that clear, and for me as a non-believer, I think I could personally comfortably be with someone who was religious, of any religion, whether it was Judaism or Islam or Hinduism or a Sikh or anybody like that, as long as they were tolerant, because that's what spiritual intimacy is, the ability to safely share our lives and our spirituality with each other. And it doesn't, so often what we think, I think, and what we're taught in religion is that spiritual intimacy is a consequence of spiritual identicality. But it's not a consequence of being identical any more than sexual intimacy is a consequence of being identical. Because if you're heterosexual, you hope the genitalia of your partner is different, but you're still able to enjoy sexual intimacy. Mm-hmm. And spiritual intimacy between a non-believer and a believer would be simply being able to share that portion of life that addresses the invisible, those concerns like values, morals, the reason for existence, philosophy of life, all of those kinds of things are part of our spirituality. And I think there are probably a lot of tolerant religious people out there for whom their religion works for them and they're not ready to depart from it, but they can also be the sort of person who could fall in love with somebody who's absolutely not religious. And what a wonderful thing that would be. I think that would be very interesting and very fun.
Would you go to church with them?
I would certainly experience what it was like, and I would do that honestly as part of my due diligence before getting connected. Because if I went to their church and their church was rabidly different from anything I'd been led to believe, like very intolerant of human diversity, very racist, or very sexually intolerant of human diversity, I would have to look at my partner and say, "What's up? How can you be a part of this?" And because you've talked to me about how tolerant you are and how accepting you are of human nature, but I've had gay clients who believed they were Christians, who were attending conservative fundamentalist churches that preached against homosexuality in the most extreme terms. But it was because, they unresolved within them, they had some homophobia of their own, and they themselves were somewhat self-loathing because they really wished they could be different than who they are. And it took them years to sort that out. And I'm not kidding. It took them years to step away. And I think for the same reason that I had a hard time, because there's something wonderful about the core of every religion's founding. There's some beautiful beliefs about the universe and the moral principles and the revelation of, what's exposed in the universe. I think there's a lot to like about religion, except the religion itself.
Yeah.
So he was taught a lesson. It's okay for you to be homosexual, so long as you're not actually homosexual.
Yeah.
So you can't be dating other men. You can't be, engaging in cuddling with other men or kissing other men or having sex with other men. Like none of that is allowed, but we'll tolerate you. So he had to actually be a sexual being who took on a mantle of asexuality.
And then how did that, what happens to clients that repress that? I mean, aside from maybe acting out, do they ever have physical symptoms? Do you notice?
Oh, well, you can imagine the stressors that would come into your own mind from hating yourself and from finding yourself, unacceptable, and knowing that if God ever finds out, you are going to hell. So keep it on the down low.
Yeah. I mean, that's got to take a long time to work through.
It does. Even in a very clear case like the one I just shared, it takes human beings a long time to work through the early childhood teachings that, Jesus is good, God is good, or, the the teachings of any religion.
Yeah.
It takes a long time to let go. And I don't let go entirely. Like I would feel perfectly comfortable reading passages from the King James Version of the Bible, or lots of other Bibles for that matter. I would feel perfectly comfortable reading John Milton's poetry, which is heavily referencing the Bible. I think it's important for Westerners, at the very least, to be biblically literate, so they can understand Western civilization. But I don't think organized religion is doing those who are struggling to manage their love lives intelligently. I don't think it's doing them any favors.
Yeah, well, I don't see it either. I mean, most people, like my friends who've been married, who are religious, are divorced, or a lot of times, sometimes they'll be in horrible relationships and they'll use the religion as like I don't know. It's like they're religious, so it's okay, or there's something there. I don't really understand it. I mean, it's like
a lucky rabbit's foot, and you keep pitching winning baseball games. You don't want to leave that rabbit's foot at home. And it's like, it's kind of it's like
but their life isn't good. It's like
but it's comforting. I think it's comforting. And you mentioned your friends who are religious, who are now divorced
or drinking too much, or in relationships that are less than satisfactory,
because they're unhappy in all cases. And that's not necessarily true, of course, for people who are in religion. People who are in religions can have happy marriages, but it's, to me, an indicator that this elective procedure, like a surgery, an elective procedure like joining a religion, is actually supposed to make my life better. That's the implied warranty.
Yeah.
That it's going to make my life a better life and my relationships better. But in my own surveys of my clients over the last 20 years, I have found that among the sex offender treatment population, sex offenders as a group went to church a lot when they were younger, multiple times generally for years of their young lives. And they aren't all religious by the time they committed their crimes, but many of them still are. And what's intriguing about that is young parents often think, well, we're parents now, we need to get back to church and start taking our children to Sunday school. Yeah. And this is going to help them, when in fact it offers apparently very little, if any, protective effect. And going by the demographics that I saw, I would say it actually has a deleterious effect, because religion encourages us to think about, in terms of magical thinking, that if I pray or I do this ritual, then everything will work out. If I marry a girl from church, and if we don't have sex before marriage, we're going to be okay.
Yeah. And
then, they're not okay. And so then he doesn't know what to do. It's because I'm not trying hard enough. I need to pray harder. Yeah. I need to pray more. I need to cling to the Lord, that the devil will flee from me. And, on and on and on. It goes.
It never ends.
And because none of it has anything to do with relationships. And so it's that lucky rabbit's foot and the magical thinking that they think is going to make it all kind of come together, because no one in church, no one in their family, no one in our society is talking about how to build a relationship that is based on equality, that includes an ethic of the abuse-free lifestyle, and that encourages an intentional interview so that you could build something that would actually make sense.
Yeah.
We don't do that. And religion has never done that. Partly, it's forgivable, because partly the human race has only been living long enough for it to be a problem in recent decades. And in the years before that, we would either die at such a young age, or our partner would die. That really didn't matter. I mean, we would be alive long enough to reproduce and maybe get the kids started, and then it was time. Die. Yeah, then you die. And so it didn't matter that I wasn't happy. It didn't matter that she wasn't happy. It mattered that we're having kids and we're feeding them and they survive. So in the 20th century, it became kind of important to married people to be happy. And then there was a shift and an evolution where no, we need to be happy enough. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't enough just to be happy. We have to be happy enough. And I think that that's humanism. And I think that that's a reasonable goal. Of course, you and I would want our own children to be happy. And if they weren't happy, we would not encourage them to stay in a relationship that was making them miserable. Mm-hmm. So divorce is part of managing my love life intelligently.
Yeah.
And the belief that I can get a divorce or I can break up with someone without committing a sin, even if we already had sex, that I'm going to be okay. That's also a part of my spirituality. Mm-hmm. So I think it's important for people to think this through. And I would invite even the religious people out there listening to this to think it through. I've had religious people tell me, well, I can't get a divorce because even though I'm not happy in my marriage, it would be a tremendous sin and it would just be wrong. I can't do that. And then I usually pose this thought experiment to them. I think this is probably a good place to sign off today, is just, I ask them if your son, who is only 5 right now, mm-hmm. if he grew up to 25 and he found himself in a marriage that was just like yours, would you tell him he had to stay? Or would you encourage him to get humble and admit he made a mistake and move on? And the many loving religious parents that I've worked with mm-hmm. all hang their head and they all admit they would give the advice to leave to their own child. And so if you can imagine an arithmetic mm-hmm. problem, what you would do for yourself minus what you would do for your child, and that the answer is that's just how much denial you have.
Oh, and then do they often see that? Do they?
Oh yeah, they do.
So they hang their head and they're like, you just
ruined it.
You ruined it, Steve. And then they
don't go out and get a divorce. They don't go out.
Oh, they don't get the divorce.
They don't go out and get a divorce typically. But again, it's a process, because when it comes to these emotionally held beliefs, and emotionally held beliefs are important. They provide motivation after all. These emotionally held beliefs are very slow to change.
Yeah. So it's not just like a flick and then they're like, all right, yeah, divorce.
Now I see. Okay. Yeah. I'm filing for divorce tomorrow.
But they see it, and then it's a process from there to unravel maybe all the other stuff.
To disengage and disentangle and to kind of develop. And of course, in the back of their mind, they're still hoping for a miracle, that things will magically change. The person who doesn't love me will start loving me. The person who will never have sex with me will start having sex with me. It goes on for a while, but most people, I think, over time, if they remain open-minded, they detach, they become less caring, and they become free, because they're not married to any particular outcome. They're just interested in ultimately what's going to work.
Yeah. All right. Well, and how long could that I'm just interested now, like how long could that process take then for somebody? Like, could that take like years and years?
Absolutely. Decades even. And some people never get to the end of it before they die.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's why I think it's so important for people to embrace humility as a spiritual value, because it brings with it the confidence that I'm okay. Might sound weird to talk about confidence and humility in the same breath, but the confidence that it's okay to be wrong, and I'm okay if I was wrong, and that I'm going to be okay if I admit that I was wrong. And even some scientists, right, have a hard time admitting that, and they get very rigid and very stuck in their thinking. So it's not just scientists versus non-scientists, or atheists versus the deeply religious. It's a human problem that we all need to work through. And it's a process that's ongoing. It's like the intentional interview, which I know you understand is an ongoing process.
Mm-hmm.
This process of growing spiritually and becoming increasingly okay with being flawed, that's an ongoing process too.
Yeah. Cool. Great. Well, let's end there. And to wrap things up, we have a listener question. If you have a question for Steve, you could visit stevening.com and fill out the contact form. So this question is as follows. I read your Psychology Today article called How to Include Sexuality into Your Wellness Practice. When I brought this up to my wife, she said I was just looking for excuses to pressure her into more sex. I admit there's truth to that, but I feel like a healthy sex life is definitely part of having a well-rounded, happy life. For my wife, it's another chore on her list of things she has to get done. We went to a marriage counselor whose only advice was that I offer to help out more, which I did, but nothing changed. What should we do? We definitely don't want a divorce.
We definitely don't want a divorce. But do we? So that's kind of challenging in that, well, let me just say, none of us get married with the idea that we want a divorce.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's fair to say, just like abortion, nobody really wants a divorce, but some of us find it the best solution to a given problem, just like abortion.
Mm-hmm.
And when it comes to that particular relationship, the idea that any of us would be married to somebody who finds making love to us a chore, and that any attempt to resolve our sexual differences is somehow manipulative, and you're only doing it because you want more sex, not because you want more sex with me, that sounds like a relationship that's already on its last legs.
Mm-hmm.
What's missing is not the divorce, but the recognition that you're already not really in a viable marriage.
Yeah. And I would add, he could do the thought experiment with the children.
Right. I think that thought experiment would really be good for that individual.
Yeah. All right, great. Well, thank you for the question. And thanks, Steve. It's great as chatting as always. And we'll catch you all later.
Bye now.